Out on a lonely New Mexico highway, two deputies thought pulling over a black man in a silver Cadillac Escalade would be just another easy stop. What they didn't know was that Marcus Hale wasn't just any driver. He was someone with the power to flip their entire world upside down. Stay tuned for this gripping story. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share the video with your friends. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a flat ocean of sand and scrub under the punishing sun. The asphalt of State Route 47 shimmered in the heat, a wavering black ribbon cutting through the pale expanse of New Mexico. Out here, silence was its own kind of sound, a low hum of cicadas carried by the wind and the occasional groan of tires against sun-baked pavement. For most travelers, it was the kind of road that felt eternal, mile after mile of nothing broken, only by the occasional rest stop or sun-bleached billboard promising a diner that had probably closed years ago. For Marcus Hale, though, this emptiness was peace. Marcus was a man in his early 50s, his skin marked with the graceful lines of time, and the weight of battles fought both seen and unseen. Behind the wheel of his silver Cadillac Escalade, he looked less like a tourist and more like a figure carved from steadiness itself. The big SUV purred along at 65 miles an hour, its chrome edges catching the sun like a blade. Inside the cabin was a cool sanctuary, the hum of the engine blending with the smooth groove of a Marvin Gaye classic flowing through the speakers. Marcus tapped his fingers lightly on the steering wheel, not in impatience, but in rhythm, enjoying the rarest luxury of all quiet. For the last 10 days, he had been just Uncle Marcus. He had flown down from Washington, D.C. to Albuquerque, then made the drive south to spend time with his sister's family. For once, there were no secure briefings, no midnight calls that dragged him into crisis rooms, no coded reports demanding immediate decisions. He had spent the days grilling on the patio, teaching his nephew how to throw a football, and laughing in ways that felt both strange and necessary. Now heading back north, he was savoring the final stretch of solitude before boarding a plane that would take him back to the storm of his real life. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about the scene, a middle-aged black man cruising down an empty highway in a clean, powerful car. But in small-town New Mexico, where silence was often louder than the truth, it was enough to draw eyes. And it did. Sitting in a dust-streaked county patrol car parked behind a row of mesquite trees, Deputy Alan Rourke adjusted his sunglasses and leaned forward. He had been on the job nearly 3 decades, long enough for his badge to be less a symbol of service and more a shield of habit. His skin was the color of tanned leather, his jaw locked in a permanent clench that made him look perpetually irritated with the world. He saw the Escalade gliding down the road and let out a low whistle. "Now what do we have here?" he muttered almost to himself. Beside him in the passenger seat, Deputy Kyle Sutter perked up. Younger by 2 decades, Sutter carried himself like a coiled spring, always fidgeting, always waiting for the next hit of adrenaline that made him feel alive. His right hand drummed restlessly against the grip of his holstered weapon, a nervous tic that hadn't gone unnoticed by his superiors, but had yet to be corrected. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Nice ride," Sutter said, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Bet that thing costs more than my house." Rourke snorted. Bet the driver didn't pay for it fair and square either. The assumption hung in the air, ugly and unspoken. They both knew what it meant. A black man, a luxury car. Out here, that equation always added up the same way in their minds. The Escalade rolled past, steady and smooth, Marcus unaware of the eyes following him. Rourke shifted the cruiser into gear gravel, crunching beneath the tires as they pulled onto the highway. The patrol car accelerated quickly, closing the distance, its engine growling like a predator, catching scent of prey. Inside his Escalade, Marcus caught the flicker of movement in the rearview mirror. His fingers stilled on the wheel. A white and blue Dodge Charger County issue was eating up the distance behind him. He had seen this dance before in too many states on too many highways. The details changed: the uniforms, the accents, the number on the badge, but the choreography was always the same. He checked his speed. Exactly 65 in a 65 zone. Perfect. He was meticulous that way, always careful to leave no cracks for someone else to wedge open. But he also knew enough to recognize that sometimes the cracks were invented. The Charger slid in tight, its bumper almost kissing the rear of the Escalade. A message. Marcus exhaled slowly, the desert sunlight flashing across his face. He eased his foot off the accelerator, letting his speed drop a few miles, a nonverbal offering of compliance. The patrol car didn't budge. Then the lights came alive, red and blue strobes, igniting against the emptiness of the desert. Marcus clicked his signal, guiding the Escalade smoothly onto the shoulder. The tires rolled over gravel, crunching beneath the weight of the SUV until the vehicle came to a stop. He shifted into park, rolled down the driver's side window halfway, and placed both hands on the wheel, open, visible, deliberate. Every movement was measured, each one performed with the kind of muscle memory born from years of understanding exactly how dangerous these moments could be. Behind him, the patrol car idled its engine, a low growl. Two doors opened. Marcus watched them in the mirrors, one man moving with heavy, deliberate steps, the other with a restless bounce. A textbook pincer move, one approaching the driver's side, the other circling to the passengers. Rourke adjusted his belt as he stepped closer, his shadow stretching long across the gleaming silver paint of the Escalade. His face was unreadable beneath the sunglasses, but his posture dripped with casual authority, the kind that dared to be challenged. Sutter, meanwhile, twitched with barely restrained energy, his eyes scanning the SUV like a thief casing a store. Marcus kept his gaze forward, his breathing calm, though a familiar tension coiled in his chest. Out here on this endless stretch of highway, the balance of power tilted with dangerous ease. He spoke first, his voice even. "Is there a problem, officer?" The question hung in the hot air, simple but loaded an invitation and a boundary all at once. Rourke didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his eyes wander from Marcus's face, to his hands, to the leather interior of the Escalade. Finally, he leaned closer, tapping the window with two fingers. "License and registration," Rourke said, his tone flat. "Saw you drift over the line back there." Marcus turned his head, his eyes locking onto Rourke's face. His own expression didn't flicker. "No, you didn't," he replied evenly. Then, after a beat, "But here are my documents." He moved slowly, deliberately, one hand to the glove compartment, the other steady on the wheel. Every motion was exaggerated, meant to be read as safe. He passed the documents out through the narrow gap of the lowered window. Rourke took them, squinting at the name on the license, his lips curling into a half-smirk. "Hale," he muttered, dragging out the syllable like it tasted bitter in his mouth. "Marcus Hale." He held the license a moment too long before flicking his eyes toward Sutter, a near-invisible nod. And in that instant, Marcus knew. This wasn't about traffic. It never was. The desert air was still yet inside Marcus Hale's chest. The atmosphere grew heavier, denser, as if the horizon itself had shifted against him. The silver Escalade sat parked neatly on the gravel shoulder, its wide chrome grille pointed toward infinity, while behind it the patrol car idled like a predator, satisfied with cornering its prey. Dust kicked up by its tires, swirled in lazy spirals, carried by the faint wind that blew across the highway. Marcus's hands remained where he had placed them, 10 and 2 on the wheel, open, visible, deliberate. To an onlooker, his calm might have seemed practiced. To Marcus, it was survival worn into his body by years of experience in rooms and on roads where one wrong breath could alter the story forever. The deputies approached in a slow, staggered rhythm, their steps out of sync but purposeful. Rourke's gait was steady, heavy with the weight of time and cynicism, while Sutter bounced forward with restless energy, the kind of swagger that belonged less to training and more to impulse. They flanked the escalade with the practiced choreography of men who had done this many times before, only here on this stretch of sun-scorched New Mexico asphalt, it was less protocol than performance. Through the half-lowered window, Marcus could feel their presence radiating. Rourke leaned in slightly, his shadow spilling over the SUV's interior like a stain. His eyes slid from Marcus's face to his hands, then down to the gear shift and across the black leather seats, searching for something, anything that might justify what they had already decided to do. License and registration. Rourke had said, his voice flat, detached, almost bored, and Marcus, slow and deliberate, had complied. The documents now rested in Rourke's hand, though the deputy held them loosely, not as evidence of identification, but as leverage, a tool to stretch the silence to make Marcus wait. The younger deputy Sutter had drifted toward the rear passenger side window, his right hand brushing his holstered weapon, with the casual intimacy of someone who enjoyed being feared. His eyes darted constantly first to Marcus's profile, then to the dashboard, then back to Rourke, like a jackal waiting for permission to bite. Marcus sat motionless. His breathing measured his pulse, a quiet drumbeat in his ears. He had lived this moment before. Not this exact stretch of road, not these exact faces, but the ritual was familiar. The stop, the accusation, the unspoken calculation of whether he would walk away whole or broken. He knew the rules of the game. Stay calm, stay polite. Keep the fire of indignation buried beneath layers of composure. But beneath that composure, the weight pressed down heavier with each second. It was not fear, not anymore. It was the exhaustion of recognition. Racial profiling was not new to him. It was as old as his first license, as predictable as the desert sunrise. Yet even with decades of resilience behind him, he could feel its sting as sharply now as he had when he was 19, pulled over in a borrowed car, told that he fit the description. "Where are you headed?" Hale Rourke finally asked, his tone curling around Marcus's last name like an insult. He said it slow, deliberate, as though testing how the syllables would sound when written on a report. Marcus turned his head slightly, just enough to meet the older deputy's gaze. His voice was steady, stripped of ornament. "North officer, back to Albuquerque." "Long way from home, aren't you?" Rourke countered, though he hadn't asked where home was. It wasn't curiosity. It was a probe, a push. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed alive with the tension of things unsaid. Marcus knew better than to fill it. Sutter broke it instead. "Car like this," he muttered, circling toward the rear bumper, "always has something interesting in the trunk." Marcus kept his eyes forward, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The script was already unfolding. Rourke shifted his weight, the leather of his duty belt creaking. "Step out of the car," he asked, not as a request, but as a looming inevitability. Marcus's fingers flexed slightly against the wheel before he spoke. "On what grounds, officer?" His tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it. That was the first spark. Sutter's eyes lit up, feeding on the friction. His hand dropped fully to the butt of his sidearm now, his thumb brushing the safety strap. "Got something you don't want us to see in there, buddy?" His words dripped with mockery, but his stance screamed readiness. Marcus inhaled slowly, letting the desert heat fill his lungs, letting the pause stretch just long enough to remind them he was unshaken. "I know my rights," he said evenly. "And I know exactly what's in my trunk." It was not defiance, it was declaration. The air between them grew denser, hotter, though the sun hadn't changed. Rourke's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as if he couldn't quite decide whether Marcus's calm was an insult or a challenge. He leaned closer, close enough for Marcus to catch the stale tang of coffee on his breath. "This doesn't have to be difficult," he said, his voice a low growl. "You can either comply or we can make this a whole lot harder for you." Marcus did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, on the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching northward. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but sharp. "Then, do it. By the law." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Rourke's face hardened. Sutter shifted again, his fingers now tapping impatiently against the handle of his weapon. The choreography was quickening, the performance escalating, but Marcus's role remained the same, steady, deliberate, immovable. A passing car slowed as it approached, the driver rubbernecking to take in the scene, a black man in a luxury SUV, flanked by 2 white deputies on a deserted road. To the outside eye, it looked routine, ordinary, invisible in its commonness. And that was what made it dangerous. Inside the Escalade, Marcus exhaled again, slow and deliberate. He felt the familiar weight pressing down years of history condensed into a single stop on a forgotten highway. Yet he also felt the steadiness that had carried him through every storm before. He knew who he was. He knew the line he would not cross. The deputies didn't, and in that widening gap between arrogance and composure, between profiling and restraint, the tension stretched thin, ready to snap. The desert heat pressed down like a hand from the sky, flattening sound and stretching seconds into minutes. Marcus Hale sat inside his silver Escalade, still and composed, while deputies Rourke and Sutter prowled around him like hunters circling prey. The silence between them was not silence at all. It was thick thrumming, vibrating with hostility. Marcus could feel it in his bones, in the shift of gravel beneath Rourke's boots, in the impatient scrape of Sutter's fingertips against his holster. It was the sound of men who had already decided the ending before the first line was written. Rourke leaned down to the half-open window, the desert sun catching on the lenses of his aviator sunglasses, so Marcus could see nothing but his own reflection staring back at him. That reflection was calm, steady, unreadable. But Rourke's voice betrayed the contempt simmering just beneath the surface. "You drifted across the center line back there," he said, his tone clipped, rehearsed. Not an observation, an accusation, one he had used 1,000 times before, on 1,000 stretches of empty road. Marcus's eyes didn't move from the horizon ahead. His voice was low, even like polished stone. "No, I didn't." Rourke's mouth twitched, the faintest smile curling at one corner. He hadn't expected an outright denial, at least not one delivered so calmly. He turned the license over in his hand, squinting at it again, drawing out the silence like a rope. Sutter broke in, his voice sharper, less controlled. "Yeah, I saw it too. Little swerve, real subtle. Could be fatigue. Could be something else. You been drinking, sir?" The last word came out hard, a mockery of politeness. Marcus turned his head just enough to glance at Sutter through the side mirror. "No," he said simply. The younger deputy bristled at the brevity, the refusal to be baited into elaboration. His hand brushed the grip of his sidearm again, the gesture automatic, habitual, like a child sucking a thumb for reassurance. Rourke leaned closer, his shadow filling the Escalade's cabin. Mind stepping out for a minute. Marcus shook his head once. "On what grounds?" "That did it." Both deputies stiffened as if the words themselves were an affront. In their world, on their road, Questions were not supposed to flow uphill. Authority was theirs to wield, not to justify. Sutter moved to the rear of the escalade, his boots crunching gravel in a rhythm Marcus knew too well. The younger man's voice carried forward, eager, almost playful. Bet this trunk's got a story or two inside. Marcus's eyes flickered toward the rearview mirror. He saw Sutter's hand hover near the latch, saw the anticipation gleaming in his stance. He spoke firmly, his tone cutting clean through the hot air. I do not consent to a search. You do not have probable cause. The words hung like a warning flare. Rourke's jaw clenched. We can make this easy, he said, his voice flattening into something darker. Or we can make it difficult. Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line, but his tone didn't waver. Then, follow the law. Get your supervisor. Sutter chuckled from behind a sharp, ugly sound. Oh, we don't need a supervisor to deal with this. Not when you've already given us enough reason. No reason has been given. Marcus corrected, his voice quiet, but carrying precise. I was not speeding. I was not swerving. You have no lawful grounds to detain me. It was the truth. But out here, the truth weighed less than perception, and perception was theirs to shape. Rourke exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate, like a bull readying to charge. He straightened to his full height, squared his shoulders, and spoke as if dictating the outcome into existence. Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Hale. We're going to have a look in your trunk. Marcus shook his head again, calm but unmovable. Not without cause, not without oversight. You know that. Rourke's composure cracked, if only slightly, the corners of his mouth hardening. He wasn't used to this refusal, this steady wall of resistance that didn't come in the form of yelling or threats, but in calm, immovable clarity. It rattled him in ways even violence never could. Sutter didn't wait. With a glance at Rourke, he moved toward the back, his hand already reaching for the latch. Marcus's pulse quickened, though his body remained still. His voice rose just enough to carry. You are violating my rights. This stop is unlawful, and this search is without consent. Sutter grinned over his shoulder, the desert sun gleaming off his teeth. Guess we'll let the evidence speak for itself. Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before, read about it, counseled others through it. The script was as old as the badge, and as corrosive as rust. Rourke leaned down again, close enough now that Marcus could feel the heat of his presence through the window. You think you're clever, he murmured. But out here, clever don't mean much. Out here, the badge speaks louder than your words. Marcus turned slowly, locking eyes with the older deputy through the shadow of the sunglasses. His voice was quiet, sharp as glass. Then, I suggest you remember what that badge is supposed to represent. The words cut through the desert air like a blade. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Rourke's face. Anger, uncertainty, maybe even recognition. But it passed quickly, replaced by the mask of arrogance he wore as easily as the uniform itself. Behind them, a sharp pop broke the moment the sound of the Escalade's trunk releasing. Marcus's heart sank, though his face betrayed nothing. Sutter had gone ahead, his fingers nimble, his grin widening as he lifted the hatch. Rourke's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Well, he said, straightening, let's see what you've been hiding. And in that instant, Marcus knew the game was already rigged. The sound of the trunk latch releasing echoed like a gunshot in the desert stillness. Marcus Hale sat motionless behind the wheel hands, still visible on the steering wheel, eyes locked straight ahead. He could not see Sutter, but he could hear him, the scrape of boots on gravel, the creak of metal as the trunk rose, the faint whistle of someone who believed he was already in control of the story. Seconds stretched long. Then came the sound Marcus had expected, but dreaded a sharp exhale of false discovery, followed by a smug voice carrying easily over the empty highway. "Well, look what we've got here." Sutter called his tone a blend of triumph and mockery. Marcus's eyes shifted to the rear-view mirror. Sutter was walking back toward the driver's side window, a small, clear plastic bag pinched delicately between his thumb and forefinger. The bag glinted in the sun, the fine white powder inside catching the light like ground glass. Sutter dangled it in the air as if it were a trophy, his grin wide, cruel, and juvenile. "Guess you forgot to mention this little party favor, huh?" he sneered, holding it just high enough so Marcus could see it through the glass. Rourke's expression hardened into something practiced, a mask he had worn many times before. He leaned down toward the window. His voice, suddenly official, clipped the kind of tone designed for courtroom transcripts. Possession of a controlled substance, he said, his words falling with deliberate weight. "That's a felony, Mr. Hale." Marcus inhaled slowly, deliberately willing the tension to dissipate from his chest. He turned his head just enough to look at the bag, then back at Rourke. His voice was calm, precise. "That bag isn't mine." Sutter chuckled, a short, sharp bark. "Oh, come on. You think anybody's gonna believe that you were swerving, you looked nervous, and now we've got this. Open and shut." Marcus's gaze sharpened, his eyes steady and unflinching. "I was not swerving. I was not nervous. And that powder was not in my vehicle when you opened the trunk." The deputies exchanged a glance. Rourke's jaw flexed. Sutter's grin widened. This was the part they enjoyed, the tightening of the trap, the certainty that their word would outweigh the truth of the man before them. Out here, they were the authors, the editors, the publishers. They wrote the report, and the world was expected to read it as gospel. Rourke leaned closer, his breath sour with stale coffee. "You're a long way from home, Hale." He murmured the words dripping with menace. "Out here in the real world, people who argue with the law find themselves in a world of hurt." Marcus didn't flinch. His tone was low but sharp enough to cut steel. "I am not arguing. I am stating a fact. I do not consent to this search. That item does not belong to me, and I am formally requesting legal representation, effective immediately." For a moment, silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Rourke's eyebrows arched in mock surprise, as though the very idea of rights was a joke he'd heard before, and never found funny. He turned his head slightly toward Sutter. "You hear that? We got ourselves a regular city lawyer." Sutter laughed again, louder this time. The guilty ones always know the most fancy words. "I am not guilty," Marcus replied, his voice even unyielding. "And if you were confident in your evidence, you wouldn't need to resort to cheap insults." The words landed hard. Rourke's face tightened, the mask of professionalism slipping to reveal the contempt underneath. He stepped closer, filling the window with his presence, his shadow blotting out the light. "You think, because you drive a nice car, you're somebody special. Out here a badge means more than your opinion." Marcus's reply came smooth, unwavering. "Then I suggest you uphold the law that badge represents. Call your supervisor." Now, it was the last straw. The calmness, the precision, the refusal to crumble it, was like sandpaper against their arrogance, and the friction was igniting fury. Sutter's grin faltered into something sharper, more dangerous. Rourke's face flushed with heat that had nothing to do with the sun. From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw the bag of powder still dangling in Sutter's hand, flimsy, weightless, yet carrying the full mass of their intent. He knew what it meant. In a courtroom, it would be the star witness. In a report, it would be the headline. In the eyes of the public, it would be proof. And yet, despite the heat pressing down, despite the inevitability that seemed to tighten like a noose around his throat, Marcus's back remained straight, his jaw set. His voice, when it came again, was steady as a metronome. "This stop is illegal. That evidence is planted, and every word, every move you make from this point forward will be recorded, remembered, and answered for." The statement was not a plea, it was a prophecy. But the deputies didn't hear it that way. They heard only insolence, only resistance dressed up in dignity. And in their world, dignity was the greatest insult of all. Sutter stepped closer, shoving the bag toward the window until it hovered inches from Marcus's face. "You're done," he hissed. "Finished. Another statistic. Another name in a file." Marcus turned his head, locking eyes with the young deputy through the glass. His voice was so calm it was almost frightening. "No, not this time." For a moment, just a moment, the desert seemed to still completely. Even the cicadas quieted, as if the air itself was waiting to see which way the balance would tip. Then Rourke snapped. His voice dropped into a low, menacing growl. "Get out of the car!" Marcus shook his head, once slow and deliberate. "Not without a supervisor. You have no lawful cause for my arrest, and I will not legitimize it. That bag is inadmissible. This farce is over." But it wasn't over. Not yet. Rourke's face contorted the mask of authority, shattering into raw fury. With a guttural snarl, he reached through the open window, unlocked the door, and yanked it wide, the hinges groaning under the sudden force. His hand clamped down on Marcus's arm, fingers digging into muscle like talons, hauling him out into the punishing sun. The trap had been sprung. The performance had begun. And Marcus Hale, calm, resolute, and unyielding, knew he was stepping not just into an arrest, but into a battle that reached far beyond this lonely stretch of New Mexico highway. The door of the Escalade groaned as Rourke wrenched it open, the sound grating across the silent desert like metal tearing apart. Marcus Hale, steady and deliberate only moments before, was seized by the arm, the deputy's fingers digging in with the precision of claws. Rourke yanked him from the driver's seat into the blinding heat, the sun striking Marcus full in the face, as if the desert itself bore witness. Gravel crunched beneath polished shoes not made for this roadside theater. The act was no longer pretense, it was spectacle. Sutter was already moving, eager as a vulture. He circled in with a blur of motion, his boots kicking up a haze of dust that clung to the air. He carried the bag of white powder like a prize, his grin fixed in place. "Not so clean now, huh?" he jeered. "Thought you were special. Thought you were above it all." Marcus steadied his footing, his shoulders square, his voice clear, despite the bruising grip on his arm. "This is an illegal arrest," he declared, projecting each word like a stone hurled into the still air. "That evidence was planted. I demand both of your badge numbers now." His tone was not raised, but it was sharp, so sharp it cut through the deputy's mockery. For an instant Sutter's grin faltered, but arrogance quickly returned, feeding off the imbalance of power, off the satisfaction of watching composure pressed beneath force. Rourke shoved Marcus hard against the side of the Escalade, the sun-heated metal branding his shirt with blistering heat. The slam echoed across the open desert, a sound too loud for emptiness, too violent for silence. Rourke's forearm pinned Marcus in place, while the handcuffs came out cold, unyielding steel. The ratcheting clicks carved into the air, each one deliberate, each one a punishment disguised as procedure. Click, too tight. Click, tighter still. Click, until the steel bit into skin and muscle, sending fire through Marcus's wrists. Sutter leaned in, his lips curling into a hiss near Marcus's ear. "Not so calm now, are you, big shot?" His voice carried the thrill of dominance, the intoxication of control. Marcus gritted his teeth, his jaw locking against the surge of pain. His back stayed straight, his posture unbroken. His voice, though tight with strain, held its steel. "I am not resisting. I offered no resistance. This is unlawful, and every second of it will be accounted for." Rourke yanked the cuffs once more almost gleefully, then shoved Marcus away from the Escalade, forcing him toward the waiting patrol car. Each shove was punctuated by gravel skidding under Marcus's polished shoes, by the clink of metal on metal, by the deputies' laughter rising into the desert air like smoke. Behind them, the road did what roads always do: it carried witnesses. A white sedan slowed as it approached its driver's face, pale and uneasy. A pair of teenagers in a rust-red pickup truck leaned out of the window, their expressions a mix of morbid curiosity and reluctant pity. To them, to every passerby, the image was painfully familiar: a black man, hands cuffed, flanked by white deputies. An old American scene replayed in the heat of the New Mexico sun. No one saw the planted bag. No one saw the arrogance that had unfolded in silence minutes earlier. All they saw was what they were meant to see: another one caught. The humiliation pressed in heavy, not because Marcus felt shame, he did not, but because he knew the weight of perception. He knew how quickly the truth could be swallowed by the appearance of guilt, how easily dignity could be erased by the click of handcuffs and the shadow of authority. Sutter, sensing the eyes on them, raised the bag theatrically for the passing motorists to see his grin, wolfish, his voice rising. "Got ourselves a real criminal here," he barked, his words slicing into the desert air. The sedan sped up the driver's gaze, dropping, unwilling to engage. The teenagers in the truck exchanged a look, unease flickering between them, before they too drove off, the dust of their tires quickly swallowed by the highway. Rourke shoved Marcus toward the back door of the cruiser, his grip unrelenting, his contempt unhidden. "Move!" he barked. "You're done here." Marcus stumbled once, the cuffs throwing off his balance, but he corrected immediately, his spine rigid, his gaze unbroken. Even in forced submission, he carried himself like a man unwilling to yield the final ground. "This is an illegal stop," he said again, his voice rising just enough to carry. "That evidence was planted. You are both complicit, and I will have your badge numbers." His words struck like hammers against their arrogance, but the deputies laughed, drowning steel with mockery. Sutter shoved him the last few feet, forcing him down onto the vinyl back seat of the cruiser. The door slammed, sealing Marcus behind grimy plexiglass, scratched with years of other names, other faces, other stories erased by power. Through the window, the Escalade gleamed under the relentless sun, its presence almost defiant. Beyond it, the desert stretched wide and silent, bearing witness with an indifference older than any law. Inside the cruiser, Marcus steadied his breathing. The cuffs bit deep, the sting constant, but he refused to shift, refused to yield an inch of posture. His reflection in the plexiglass was faint, ghosted by scratches, but it was enough. He looked into his own eyes, saw the calm that had carried him through storms far greater than this, and anchored himself to it. Outside, Rourke slid into the driver's seat, his hands heavy on the wheel. Sutter climbed in beside him, tossing the bag of powder onto the dashboard with theatrical flair. "Another win for the county," he muttered, still grinning. The patrol car pulled away from the shoulder gravel, spraying as the tires bit into asphalt. The Escalade grew smaller in the rear window until it disappeared, entirely swallowed by distance. Ahead, the long stretch of highway shimmered in the heat, leading north, leading nowhere. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief moment, drawing the desert air deep into his lungs, centering himself. This was not the end, he reminded himself. It was the beginning. Every second was being recorded, not by cameras, not by tapes, but by memory, by truth, by the undeniable weight of what was about to come. The deputies believed they had won. They believed they had written the ending. But Marcus knew better. He knew that humiliation, though heavy, was temporary. He knew that arrogance, though loud, was brittle. And he knew because he had built a career on knowing that power abused always left a trail, and trails always led back to their authors. For now, though, the image was what it had always been, a black man cuffed and caged in the back of a patrol car, framed against the endless desert horizon. A scene so common, it blended into invisibility. A scene so dangerous because of that invisibility. And yet beneath it, Marcus's silence was not surrender. It was a promise. The patrol car rolled through the gates of the county precinct, its tires crunching across worn asphalt, stained with oil and time. The building squatted low and wide, a block of brick and concrete that smelled of old sweat and older secrets. Marcus Hale sat in the back seat, wrists burning from the bite of the cuffs, his body pressed against the cracked vinyl bench. Through the grimy plexiglass, he watched as the deputies swaggered. Rourke's face wore the smug calm of a man convinced of victory. Sutter's grin was feral, a young wolf drunk on the taste of imagined triumph. Inside, the air was heavy with the sour mix of burnt coffee and disinfectant. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pallor that drained the color from everything beneath it. The desk sergeant barely looked up when the door swung open, and Rourke marched Marcus forward. To the sergeant it was routine, a black man in cuffs, deputies with their story rehearsed. Another name to scribble, another form to file. Possession. Resisting. Rourke grunted, pushing Marcus toward the desk. The sergeant nodded absently, his pen already scratching across the intake sheet. His face was sagged by years of monotony, the grooves of boredom etched deeper than any expression of thought. Marcus stood tall despite the cuffs, his voice steady clear, carrying across the stale room. This is an illegal arrest. That evidence was planted. I request legal representation immediately. The sergeant didn't bother to look up. He'd heard claims like that before. They rolled off him like rain on stone. He muttered name as his pen hovered over the form. Rourke shoved the license forward with a smirk. Hale. Marcus Hale. The sergeant squinted at the ID lips moving silently as he typed. The old computer on the desk hummed, its keys clacking under his stiff fingers. For a moment, the room was filled only with the sound of typing the deputies, leaning back with their arms crossed, Sutter tapping the plastic bag of powder against the desk like a drumstick. Then it happened. The screen flickered once, then twice. A red flag pulsed onto the monitor. The sergeant frowned, leaning closer, his sluggish fingers hesitating mid-keystroke. Another alert appeared, this one flashing. His brow furrowed, his back stiffening. The air seemed to shift, the hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly louder. The words glared at him from the monitor, cold and immovable. Assistant Director, Department of Homeland Security. Clearance level top secret. Do not detain. Immediate federal notification required. The sergeant's mouth went dry. His pen clattered from his hand, rolling across the desk unnoticed. He blinked once, then twice, as if the screen might change if he willed it. But the words remained damning in their certainty. He turned his head slowly, his eyes lifting to Marcus. Not the man in cuffs, not the supposed criminal, but the official photograph, now staring back at him from the database stamped with the seal of the United States government. Color drained from the sergeant's face, leaving him ashen. He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Sir, we had no idea. His eyes darted to Rourke and Sutter, then back to Marcus, terror replacing boredom. I need to get my captain. Secure line. Right now. The room froze. Rourke's smirk faltered. Sutter's grin evaporated, replaced by a flicker of something raw and dangerous fear. Marcus stepped forward, the cuffs biting into his wrists, but his presence expanding, filling the space like a rising tide. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of authority that brooked no question. Put the phone down. The sergeant froze the receiver halfway to his ear. "You will do exactly as I say." Marcus continued each word, measured, deliberate. "Lock down this building. Freeze all access to your internal network. Seal the surveillance logs for this booking desk and for every patrol car that was on duty today. Every single record is now federal evidence." The sergeant nodded, fumbling his fingers, trembling as he reached for the keyboard again. His fear was naked, his compliance absolute. Marcus turned his gaze to Rourke and Sutter. Their arrogance had bled out, leaving behind the hollow shells of men who suddenly realized the trap they had set had snapped shut around their own throats. Rourke's face was pale, his jaw working as though words might save him, but none would come. Sutter's eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape that wasn't there. Marcus straightened his back, the cuffs no longer symbols of humiliation, but of catastrophic error. His voice, low and steady, filled the room. "You thought I was just another man to be broken, just another file to vanish into your ledger. But you chose the wrong target. You chose me." The words struck like hammer blows. The deputies flinched, their silence louder than any denial. The sergeant swallowed hard, the computer keys clacking under his trembling hands as he initiated the lockdown protocols. The screen flashed confirmation: network freeze. Local systems isolated. Federal notification pending. The building itself seemed to react. Phones went dead. Printers halted mid-task. Surveillance feeds flickered their recordings, locked their access sealed. What had been a precinct of routine arrogance was now a cage of evidence, every corner turned against the men who believed it was theirs to control. Marcus stepped closer to the desk, his voice cutting clean. "From this moment, this station operates under federal authority. You will follow my instructions without deviation. Any attempt to interfere will be considered obstruction of justice." The sergeant nodded vigorously, sweat pooling at his temples. Yes, sir. Understood." Rourke finally found his voice, though it came out brittle. You can't just—" Marcus turned his eyes on him, steady, unblinking. "I can. And I am." The weight of truth crushed whatever protest remained. Rourke's shoulders slumped, the authority of his badge stripped bare. Sutter looked like a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath him had been hollow all along. For a long moment, the room was silent, but for the hum of the locked-down machines. Then Marcus spoke again, quieter now, but no less sharp. "You thought you were untouchable, but arrogance blinds. And arrogance always leaves a trail." He let the words settle heavy as stone. Less than 1 hour later, the first of Marcus's federal team arrived, black SUVs rolling in their tinted windows, reflecting the stunned faces of local officers watching their precinct transform into a sealed investigation site. Men and women in dark suits swept in with precision, their presence undeniable, their authority absolute. By then, Rourke and Sutter were gone, vanished into the desert, fleeing the collapse of the empire they thought was invisible. But it didn't matter. Their fingerprints were already etched into the story, their crimes woven into the fabric of the evidence Marcus now controlled. The humiliation of the roadside arrest had dissolved, replaced by the power of revelation. Marcus Hale was no longer the man in handcuffs. He was the man holding the keys. And, for the first time, the county precinct understood the truth: the hunter had become the hunted. The sound of engines announced their arrival before the first black SUVs rolled into the precinct lot. Their polished frames reflected the midday sun, their tinted windows impenetrable. They moved with military precision, doors opening in unison, dark-suited agents stepping out in coordinated silence. Each figure carried with them not just authority, but inevitability. The county precinct, once smug in its small dominion, now felt like an ant-hill under the shadow of boots. Marcus Hale stood tall in the booking room, the steel cuffs still locked around his wrists. But the balance of power had shifted so violently, it was almost surreal. The desk sergeant, pale and sweating, scrambled to his feet to greet the newcomers, stammering half-formed explanations. The federal agents ignored him. Their eyes sought Marcus, and when they found him, the nods of recognition were immediate. Assistant Director Hale, the lead agent, said, crisply stepping forward, "Sir, we're here under your directive. Full lockdown has been initiated. Evidence teams are en route. What are your immediate orders?" Marcus's gaze cut to the trembling sergeant. Without raising his voice, he said, "Remove these cuffs." The sergeant fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unclipped the steel, biting into Marcus's wrists. The sound of the ratchets releasing echoed louder than the clicks that had bound them. Marcus rubbed the faint welts on his skin, but his eyes were elsewhere, on the patrol logs, on the frozen screens, on the hollow faces of men who thought themselves untouchable. "Secure the evidence bag first," Marcus instructed, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Chain of custody begins now. Nobody touches it except my team." 2 agents moved immediately. They plucked the small plastic bag from the desk, where Sutter had tossed it like a toy, their gloved hands reverent, their motions deliberate. The bag was sealed inside a secondary container, tagged and logged in under federal protocol. When the forensic scanner passed over it, the truth bloomed in the glow of its readout microscopic isotopic markers, invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable to trained instruments. The powder wasn't just narcotics, it was bait. Evidence pulled from a sealed federal case against a major cartel. Evidence that should have been secured in a DHS vault nearly 800 miles away. The lead agent looked up, his expression grim. This bag was tagged in Operation Cinderfall. How the hell did it end up here? Marcus's jaw tightened. He had suspected something, but confirmation always cut deeper. He turned to the cluster of county officers gathering nervously at the edges of the room. Their badges seemed to weigh less now, their bravado leaking into the floor. Because Marcus said evenly, your deputies weren't running a traffic stop. They were running a scheme. A hush fell. The sergeant's face blanched further, sweat trickling down the lines of his sagging cheeks. Rourke and Sutter's absence loomed larger by the second their flight, the surest admission of guilt. Marcus moved toward the terminal, his posture sharp, his presence filling the room. He gestured to one of his analysts, who began combing the frozen patrol logs. The data unfolded quickly. Timestamps, GPS pings, body cam activations that should have existed but didn't. Dozens of stops, each one targeting minority drivers, each one with mysteriously corrupted footage, or reports that read like bad fiction, on the wall monitor case files stacked like bricks. Possession charges, resisting arrest charges, nearly all dismissed quietly, with defendants too poor or too weary to fight. But others ended differently. Sentences, fines, lives derailed in the name of statistics. The analysts dug deeper. In the evidence, logs patterns emerged like veins of wrought narcotics, seized, catalogued, then disappearing. Not destroyed, not processed, vanished, and then reappearing. Street busts in the same counties showing identical chemical signatures, markers that should never have matched unless the drugs were recycled. A ghost ledger, a shadow economy built not on supply chains across borders, but on theft from within. This isn't random, one agent murmured, scanning the data. It's systemic, coordinated, been running for years. Marcus's eyes narrowed. And Rourke and Sutter are just the surface. They're enforcers, not architects. The revelation settled over the room like dust, choking, inescapable. The precinct was no longer just a station, It was a crime scene, its walls steeped in corruption. Every file, every form, every erased second of video was a thread waiting to be pulled. Marcus walked to the evidence board, his voice carrying calm certainty. They planted cartel evidence on me. Evidence stolen from a federal vault. That tells us two things. One, their network has penetrated deeper than county lines. Two, they've grown arrogant enough to think no one's watching. He turned his gaze, sweeping the room. Now they know otherwise. The sergeant sank into his chair, his earlier boredom replaced by dread. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but Marcus cut him off with a glance. You'll give your statement when I ask for it. Until then, you will remain seated and silent. Everything in this building is federal property until further notice. Outside the precinct buzzed with controlled chaos. Federal SUVs blocked exits. Evidence teams in gloves and jackets carried crates inside. The ordinary rhythm of small-town policing had been obliterated, replaced by the cold precision of a federal takeover. Local officers stood in clusters, their whispers sharp with fear. Inside, the analysis deepened. Patterns became stories. Stories became confessions waiting to be unearthed. And always the name at the center, Rourke. Sutter. Their patrol histories lit up with red flags, their fingerprints smeared across every crooked entry. Marcus stood at the hub of it all, his face carved in stone. The humiliation of the roadside arrest was gone, buried beneath the gravity of what he now commanded. His voice, when he finally spoke, was both verdict and vow. They thought they were predators, but predators leave tracks. And we will follow everyone. He turned to the lead agent. Put out the alert. Rourke and Sutter are fugitives, armed and dangerous. Bring them in alive if possible. But bring them in. The order carried finality, the kind that left no room for misinterpretation. And as agents moved, as networks lit up, as the desert itself seemed to shift under the weight of what was unfolding, Marcus Hale knew the unraveling had only just begun. The planted bag wasn't just their mistake, it was their signature. A signature that would open doors into shadows they thought hidden forever. And Marcus, steady and unyielding, was already reaching for the handle. The unraveling had begun with a single bag of powder, but within hours the cracks widened into chasms. Files once considered routine collapsed under scrutiny, and patterns emerged like constellations in the night sky, each point of light connected to another by a line of corruption. Yet as deep as the rot ran, one name surfaced again and again, hidden in margins, buried in code, whispered in testimony, like a ghost, haunting every page. Elias Vargo. Marcus Hale stood in the command post the federal team had erected inside the county precinct, a conference room transformed into a war room. Screens glowed with data evidence logs, patrol routes, encrypted chatter dredged from seized devices. Every thread pulled tighter until it wound back to the same phantom figure. Vargo, a younger analyst, her voice tight with disbelief, read from a dossier projected on the wall. Elias Vargo, former contractor, Department of Defense. Specialized in logistics asset tracking and covert finance channels, declared dead 12 years ago in a supposed car accident in Nevada. But, she tapped the screen, zooming in on newer data. We're finding digital fingerprints, recent activity under his old access protocols. Payments routed through shell companies. It's him. The room hummed with unease. To build an empire from the shadows required arrogance, but to build one under the guise of being dead required something greater, certainty that the system itself would never look too closely. Marcus's eyes narrowed. The phantom ledger. The phrase had been whispered by an informant during the first sweep, half-believed, dismissed by some as conspiracy. But now the evidence screamed its reality. The ledger wasn't paper. It wasn't even digital in the ordinary sense. It was a ghost economy, built on falsified reports, erased footage, and drugs disappearing only to be reborn on the streets. Every case file touched by it had the same fingerprints, corrupted logs, altered timestamps, gaps, where body cameras should have captured truth, but captured nothing. And always behind the curtain the ghost's hand. Vargo. The files grew darker as they dug deeper. A dozen falsified possession cases in the past 2 years, all dismissed quietly. At least 9 seizures that never reached the state evidence lockers. But the most damning wasn't theft. It was blood. An analyst pulled up a case marked closed. A single page thin as a lie describing the death of a 22-year-old black man, Andre Lewis. The report claimed suicide, a hanging in his cell, less than 12 hours after arrest. The language was boilerplate, almost insultingly, so as if written to discourage questions rather than answer them. But Andre's mother had never stopped asking. She had written letters, filed complaints, begged anyone to listen. And buried in a forgotten inbox, one of those letters had reached federal ears. Attached was a grainy cell phone video, shaky but undeniable, Andre alive, beaten, his cries cut short by fists that moved with the practiced rhythm of brutality. The faces weren't obscured. They were unmistakable. Rourke and Sutter. The room went still as the footage played. Each blow was a drumbeat of corruption, each second proof that the system had not merely failed, but killed. Marcus felt the weight of it settle into his chest like a stone. He had seen many things in his career, wars fought in deserts, overseas crises that unfolded in quiet offices under fluorescent lights. But this was different. This was a young man, erased not by chance, but by design, a life folded into a lie, because it was convenient. He spoke quietly, but the words carried heavy with resolve. Andre Lewis is the centerpiece. His name anchors this case. We build everything around him. Agents nodded, some grim, some visibly shaken. The ghost ledger was about money, yes, about power and greed, but Andre's death gave it a face, a pulse, a truth that could not be hidden behind paperwork or jargon. Marcus turned back to the screens. Vargo thought staying dead would keep him untouchable. He was wrong. Ghosts leave trails too, and we will drag him into the light. The investigation widened. Bank records revealed payments to deputies across 3 counties, bribes hidden as overtime bonuses, kickbacks disguised as equipment purchases. Surveillance pulled from dark web forums showed Vargo's digital signature, an architect directing pawns always one step removed. His alias had shifted a dozen times, but his arrogance remained the same. He believed invisibility equaled invincibility. One agent muttered half to herself, "He's been playing puppet master for over a decade." Marcus's eyes hardened. Then we cut the strings. He studied Andre's file again, the single page of lies beside the grainy video of truth. His own reflection glowed faintly on the monitor, and for a moment he saw himself at 22, young and untested, walking into a world already bent against him. Andre could have been him. Andre could have been his nephew, his son, any of the young men he had mentored who believed dignity could shield them. The thought gnawed at him, steady and unrelenting. He spoke again, his voice low, almost to himself. No more ghosts, no more erasures. Around him, the room stirred with purpose. Warrants were drafted, task forces deployed. Vargo's name, once a whisper, was now a target etched in bold. And through it all, Andre Lewis's photograph, smiling, vibrant, alive, was pinned to the board at the center. A reminder. A promise. Marcus stood straighter, the sting of his earlier humiliation on the roadside now transformed into fire. The deputies thought they had trapped him. The ghost thought he had hidden. But both had underestimated the resolve of a man who had seen too much lost, too much, and carried too much to ever let this pass. Andre's death would not vanish into another one-page report. It would become the cornerstone of justice, and Elias Vargo, the phantom who thought himself untouchable, would soon learn what happened when the living hunted a ghost. The desert night was silent, but the silence was not empty. It pulsed with anticipation, the kind that comes before thunder breaks. In the distance, the faint glow of floodlights cut across the sand, their beams converging on a run-down trailer park crouched at the edge of nowhere. For weeks, the hunt had narrowed every thread of the ghost ledger pulled tight until it formed a noose. And now, with tactical precision, the noose was ready to close. Marcus Hale stood at the command vehicle, the desert wind brushing across his face. His federal team moved with a quiet efficiency that had been honed by years of training. Black-clad agents adjusted gear, checked weapons, whispered final confirmations. Inside the glowing monitors of the van, heat signatures bloomed 3 figures moving in separate spaces. Rourke, Sutter, and deeper in the shadows, the ghost himself, Elias Vargo. The order was given. Like shadows detached from the dark, the agents advanced. Doors splintered under the weight of battering rams, the crack of hinges giving way a sharp punctuation in the night. Voices thundered federal agents, hands where we can see them. Rourke was dragged from a threadbare couch, his leathery face twisted in rage and disbelief. He barked curses, spit, flying, but the fight in him was hollow. Sutter tried to run, sprinting barefoot across gravel, but the chase lasted only seconds. He was slammed into the dirt, his wrists locked in cuffs, his youthful arrogance shattered into raw panic. And then Vargo. He wasn't hiding in squalor like the deputies. No, he sat in a converted trailer, lit by a halo of monitors' screens, glowing with lines of code maps and data streams. His command center. His throne. He didn't resist. When the door burst open, he simply looked up, eyes, calm lips, curling into the faintest smirk. "I was wondering when you'd find me," he said. Marcus stepped into the doorway, his silhouette framed by the chaos of agents swarming around him. Their eyes met the living and the ghost predator and predator. "You should have stayed dead," Marcus said. Vargo's smirk widened, arrogance undimmed. "Dead men don't build empires." But arrogance was brittle. It cracked easily when caged. And by dawn, Elias Vargo's empire had crumbled into evidence crates, hard drives, and confiscated weapons stacked neatly in federal vans. The courtroom was a different kind of battlefield, one defined not by gunfire, but by silence, not by tactical raids, but by the weight of truth laid bare. Weeks later, Marcus sat in the front row as Rourke and Sutter shuffled forward, pale under the harsh lights. Their uniforms hung on them like costumes, now their badges heavy with shame. 2 U.S. Marshals stood at their sides, unflinching. The judge's words were sharp, deliberate, cutting through the hushed room. "Officers Alan Rourke and Kyle Sutter, you are found guilty of the murder of Andre Lewis, of systemic corruption, of trafficking narcotics, and of conspiracy to obstruct justice." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The sentence followed like a gavel of thunder. Life in prison. Consecutive terms, no parole. Before the words could settle, 2 marshals stepped forward. One ripped the badges from their uniforms, the polished metal clattering onto the prosecution's table. The other unclipped their empty holsters and gun belts, letting them fall with a heavy thud. The sound was final, an execution of authority. Stripped of their symbols, Rourke and Sutter looked smaller. Not hunters, not predators, just thugs in uniform, their swagger dissolved into fear. The cameras flashed, immortalizing their downfall. And then came Vargo. The architect of shadows walked into the courtroom shackled, yet his posture carried the arrogance of a man who still believed himself untouchable. He sat at the defense table with a faint smile, his lawyers whispering urgently, but his eyes found Marcus in the crowd. The trial was long, detailed, every strand of the Phantom Ledger unraveled before the court. Falsified cases, missing body cam footage, bank transfers hidden in labyrinthine accounts. And at its core, Andre Lewis's death no longer erased, but resurrected in truth. The video played on the screen, the courtroom holding its breath as the brutality unfolded. Mothers wept. Jurors stiffened. Even the judge's face darkened. When the verdict was read, Vargo's smirk finally cracked. Elias Vargo guilty on all counts: conspiracy, trafficking, corruption, murder by proxy. You are hereby sentenced to life without parole in federal custody to be served at Florence ADX Supermax. The words struck like hammer blows. The architect of ghosts would now be entombed in concrete, his empire reduced to silence and shadows behind steel bars. When it was over, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, cameras flashing like lightning. Questions flew, voices rising, but Marcus Hale did not speak. He stepped out into the sunlight with the weight of silence heavy on his shoulders. His presence alone was enough, his quiet composure, louder than any statement could have been. The victory was undeniable, but it carried a cost. The system had been forced to reveal its rot, and in doing so had exposed wounds that would take years to heal. Andre Lewis's mother stood in the crowd, her hands clasped around a worn photograph of her son. When her eyes met Marcus's, there was no need for words. He inclined his head, a gesture of respect, of promise, fulfilled. The cameras wanted triumph, but Marcus's silence told the truth. Justice, when wrestled from corruption, was never clean. It carried scars, it demanded weight, and it left those who fought for it changed forever. As he stood quietly at the courthouse steps, the sun casting long shadows across the marble, Marcus Hale embodied the paradox of power. He had dismantled an empire built on ghosts. He had brought killers to justice. Yet the silence he carried was not triumph. It was the hidden cost of bearing witness, of being the man who had seen too much and chosen against all odds to drag the truth into daylight. The reporters shouted, the crowd pressed closer, the questions sharpened. But Marcus remained still, his silence, the final word. And in that silence was the truth. Power abused had been broken, corruption had been dragged into the open, and justice, fragile, imperfect, but real, had been delivered. What does this story teach us here in America in the year 2025? It shows that corruption, no matter how carefully hidden, leaves a trail, and arrogance, no matter how strong it seems, always cracks under the weight of truth. Marcus Hale's journey reminds us that silence, when paired with courage, can speak louder than 1,000 shouts. His refusal to break under humiliation exposed not only 2 corrupt deputies, but an entire ghost network poisoning the system from within. And at the center of it all was the name of a young man, Andre Lewis, just 22 years old, whose death was nearly erased by a one-page lie. Andre's story is more than a case file, it is a mirror held up to a nation that must decide whether justice is just a word or a practice we are willing to fight for. For American citizens, the lesson is this: justice is fragile. It requires vigilance. It demands accountability, not just from those in power, but from each of us who choose to witness, to question, and to speak. We cannot look away from abuse and pretend it is rare or distant. It happens on highways, in precincts, and in courtrooms every single day. We cannot let the images of humiliation define the narrative, because behind every false arrest, every planted bag, every missing video file, there are lives, families, and futures that matter. The weight of systemic corruption is heavy, but the weight of silence is heavier still. Marcus's silence in that courtroom, standing outside as cameras flashed, was not surrender. It was a reminder of the cost of exposing the truth that justice, when pulled from the shadows, carries scars. But his silence was also power. It showed that one person armed with clarity and conviction can dismantle an empire built on lies. And that is a lesson for us all. If you believe in stories that uncover truth, that honor those erased by corruption, and that remind us of our duty as citizens, then I ask you, don't let this message stop here. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with your friends and family. Because the more we shine a light, the fewer places corruption has to hide. Together, we can ensure that stories like Andre's are not forgotten, and that justice in America is not just spoken, but lived.